A quiet night disrupted. It was one of those nights that seemed destined for peace, the kind where the world felt like it was pausing, letting the weight of the day fall off your shoulders. General Marcus Reynolds had been looking forward to this moment since dawn. After a grueling week filled with high-stakes meetings, tense strategic briefings, and decisions that would alter not just the course of military operations, but perhaps the lives of countless people, all he wanted was to feel human again. The uniform of a U.S. Army general is both an honor and a burden, and tonight, Marcus hoped to leave the latter behind. As one of the few black generals in the armed forces, Marcus was no stranger to pressure. He had dedicated his life to serving his country, rising through the ranks not only through competence, but by pushing past barriers that many of his peers never even saw. Yet tonight, none of that mattered. His rank, his status, his achievements, they were things he could put away with his uniform. Tonight was about going home to his family, sinking into the comfort of his favorite chair, and feeling normal for a few fleeting hours. The hum of the car engine and the familiar rhythm of the highway beneath his tires were the only sounds as he made his way home. The city lights reflected off the glass windows, casting a calming glow inside the vehicle. As Marcus exhaled, his thoughts drifted. His mind replayed the day's events, a particularly sensitive briefing where the stakes were higher than usual. They had been discussing national security, covert missions that could shift global power dynamics. A single wrong decision could cascade into disaster. Marcus had shouldered it all. Now, as he let the pressure go, he felt the tension leave his body, the city's night air wrapping around him like a blanket. But then, something cut through the silence like a blade. The blaring wail of police sirens jarred Marcus back to reality. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he instinctively glanced in the rearview mirror. There they were, 2 patrol cars, their lights flashing in ominous bursts of blue and red. He squinted at the mirror, confused. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't broken any traffic laws. Why were they signaling him? The confusion gnawed at him, but he dismissed it. He was a general in the United States Army. Surely there had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe they had mistaken his car for someone else's. It wasn't uncommon for misunderstandings to happen on the road. But then, the police cars accelerated, closing the distance between them and his car with unsettling speed. Marcus' heart began to pound. His mind raced, searching for an explanation. Had something happened earlier that he wasn't aware of? Was there a safety bulletin issued for his vehicle? Yet none of this made sense. He had no reason to be on the radar of law enforcement, but the unease began to grow, tightening in his chest like a fist. He considered simply continuing home, but the flashing lights were persistent, their message unmistakable. He had to pull over. Slowly, he guided his car toward the side of the road, his breath shallow as anxiety crept into his chest. The sirens wailed louder, now right behind him. As he brought his car to a stop, the sinking feeling in his stomach intensified. Something about this didn't feel right. His hands rested on the wheel, his eyes focused on the patrol cars in the mirror. He was a general, a man of honor and service, and yet the unease in his gut felt all too familiar. The patrol cars stopped behind him, and 2 officers stepped out. Marcus couldn't help but notice the tension in their postures, the aggressive way they moved. They had their hands on their holsters, their faces sharp and cold. The air felt charged, heavy with anticipation. He swallowed hard, his military training kicking in, telling him to remain calm, to control the situation with respect and authority. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was different. One of the officers, a tall man with close-cropped blonde hair, shouted at him before Marcus could even open his door. "Get out of the car. Hands where I can see them." The command was aggressive, almost angry. Marcus blinked in surprise. He had been pulled over a few times in his life, but never with this level of hostility. He knew better than to escalate things, though. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands, keeping them visible as he pushed open the door with his foot. As he stepped out, the officer shouted again, on the ground. "Hands on the hood." Marcus' confusion deepened. This wasn't a routine traffic stop. He had barely said a word before they were treating him like a dangerous criminal. He wanted to speak, to tell them who he was, to diffuse whatever this situation was before it spiraled out of control, but something about the look in their eyes stopped him. He could see it, the disdain, the judgment. They didn't see a general. They didn't even see a man. They saw something less. "Officer, there's been a mistake," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm General Marcus Reynolds of the United States Army. I'm just trying to get home." The blond officer sneered, stepping closer. "A general, huh? Sure you are." His voice was thick with sarcasm, and Marcus felt a knot tighten in his gut. Before he could protest, the second officer, a stocky man with short brown hair, grabbed Marcus' arm and twisted it behind his back, shoving him against the hood of his car. Pain shot through his shoulder, but it was the humiliation that stung more. They didn't believe him. And worse, they didn't care. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, biting into his skin, Marcus' mind raced. How had things escalated so quickly? He had done nothing wrong. Yet here he was, face pressed against the cold metal of his car, treated like a criminal. The officers rummaged through his car, ignoring his pleas to check his documents. They didn't want the truth. They had already decided who he was in their eyes. And in that moment, Marcus knew this wasn't about the law. This was about something far deeper, something far uglier. The unseen battle begins. The cold bite of metal around Marcus' wrists felt alien, jarring. Despite his years in service, despite leading troops through war zones and crisis situations, nothing had prepared him for this, a battle he couldn't see, an enemy that had no uniform but wore the familiar face of authority. His body was pinned to the hood of his own car, his vision swimming from the sudden force used by the officers. The cold pavement below his boots felt like an anchor, holding him in place, while his mind tried to make sense of what was happening. Marcus had been in perilous situations before, but none quite like this. As a soldier, he had always known the rules of engagement. The enemy was clear, the objectives defined. Here, though, there was no clear path, no strategy to defuse the situation that unfolded with dizzying speed. The officers were rummaging through his car now, their voices sharp with thinly veiled disdain. He could hear them muttering, making snide comments about the luxury car he drove. The blond officer, Hanks, Marcus had caught his name in the brief moments of chaos, was particularly vocal. "What kind of man like you can afford something like this, huh?" Hanks spat, his voice dripping with the same condescension Marcus had heard 1,000 times in his life. He didn't need to say more. The unspoken accusation was clear. Men like you aren't supposed to have things like this. Marcus winced, not just from the physical pain, but from the emotional blow that followed it. It was the kind of punch that landed deeper than any fist could, being judged not by the content of his character, his achievements, or even his rank, but by the color of his skin. In that moment he was no longer General Marcus Reynolds, leader of thousands, the man who had commanded respect in some of the world's most dangerous regions. No, to these officers, he was simply a black man behind the wheel of a nice car. And that, in their eyes, made him guilty enough. "Officer, if you just check my documents," Marcus began, his voice straining to remain calm despite the rising anger in his chest. But Hanks barely glanced his way, waving him off like an irritating fly. "I don't need to check anything," Hanks said dismissively, his hand now inside the glove compartment, rifling through papers without care. "Guys like you always have a story. Drugs? Stolen. What is it? You got a gang out here backing you up." The words hit Marcus like a slap. The assumption of guilt, the ease with which these men dismissed his humanity, was staggering. He had encountered racism in the military, discreet, sometimes overt, but nothing prepared him for this raw and blatant attack on his dignity. His heart pounded, his muscles tense with the desire to act, to stand up and assert his rank and rights, but he held himself back. Years of military discipline had taught him to remain calm in the face of adversity, to weigh his options, to never give in to rash emotions. But the injustice of this situation was a storm inside him, one he struggled to contain. He tried again, more forcefully this time. "Check my military ID. I'm a general in the United States Army. What you're doing is wrong." Robertson, the stockier of the two, turned towards Marcus, his face twisted in a mocking grin. "A general," he scoffed. "Where's your uniform then, General? Where's your fancy little army car? You expect us to believe that?" Marcus could feel the heat rising in his face. His uniform was at home, draped over the back of his chair where he had intended to leave it until morning. Tonight, he had opted for civilian clothes, something more comfortable for the drive home. It never occurred to him that dressing down might one day cost him his dignity, or worse. Before he could respond, Robertson grabbed his shoulder again, spinning him around to face them. "You think you can just say you're a general and we're supposed to roll out the red carpet?" Robertson sneered. "Nah, man, it doesn't work like that. You're just another guy who thinks he's above the law." Above the law. The phrase echoed in Marcus' head. Was that what they thought this was? A man with a nice car, a black man no less, must have done something to put himself above the law, must have cheated or stolen or lied to achieve this level of success. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Marcus. His entire career had been built on serving the law, upholding it, protecting it, ensuring that the very country these men lived in remained safe and free. He had sacrificed his time, his energy, his family life for that cause. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal by the very people who were supposed to uphold the law he had fought to protect. The cold reality of the situation settled over him like a dark cloud. His words, his achievements, his rank, they meant nothing in this moment. To these officers, his skin color had already rendered him guilty. Hanks continued his search, now holding Marcus' military ID in his hands, but instead of verifying it, he tossed it back into the car with a dismissive snort. "Nice fake," he muttered. "You must have had some real money to get one this good." The implication hit hard. They thought his ID was fake. His stomach twisted with the knowledge that there was no reasoning with them. They didn't want the truth. They wanted to believe the lie they had constructed in their minds, a lie that suited their prejudices. For a moment, Marcus considered what might happen next. His mind flashed to news stories. Black men like him who had encounters with police that ended in tragedy. He had no weapon, no intent to harm anyone, yet here he was, handcuffed and pinned against his own car, all because of a snap judgment. The realization was terrifying. He was vulnerable. Despite his years of training, despite his ability to command armies, he was at the mercy of these two men who had already made up their minds about him. Suddenly, a voice crackled over the police radio, cutting through the tense silence. "All units be advised. General Marcus Reynolds, U.S. Army, is in transit. Ensure his safe passage." Both officers froze. The color drained from Robertson's face as his hand hovered over his radio. Hank's mouth dropped slightly, his eyes widening as the weight of their actions began to sink in. Marcus could see the shift in their expressions. The shock. The dawning realization of what they had just done. Robertson's hands trembled as he looked over at Hank's. Is this for real? For the first time that night, Marcus felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they would finally listen. But as he looked into Hank's eyes, he saw something else. Fear, and with fear came desperation. Desperate men made dangerous decisions. Hanks muttered something under his breath, his hand clenching into a fist. He glanced down at Marcus, who was still restrained against the car, his expression unreadable. Marcus could see it clearly now. This wasn't over. These men were cornered, and a cornered animal is always the most dangerous. "Look," Marcus began, trying to keep his voice level, trying to give them an out. "We can end this now. Just take the cuffs off, and we can pretend this never happened." But the flicker of doubt in their eyes was quickly overtaken by something darker. Fear morphed into panic, and panic led to recklessness. "What are we supposed to do now?" Robertson hissed, glancing nervously at Hanks. "If he reports this, we're done. Finished. They'll crucify us." Hanks, still gripping his holster, stared at Marcus, his eyes darting back and forth. His mind was racing, calculating his next move, and Marcus could feel the tension ratcheting up once again. Fear turns into fire. As the night air thickened around them, the tension in the small space between Marcus and the two officers reached a boiling point. He could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the final seconds before an explosion. The crackling radio had delivered a chilling reality to the two officers. Marcus wasn't just some random black man driving a luxury car. He was a general in the U.S. Army, a man with rank and authority that stretched far beyond their small jurisdiction. But instead of diffusing the situation, the radio call had sparked something far more dangerous. Panic. Hank's eyes darted back and forth between Marcus and Robertson, his hand still resting on the grip of his gun, a bead of sweat glistening on his brow. Marcus had seen that look before, in war, on the faces of soldiers who realized they were out of options, that their survival instincts were kicking in, and there was no way out except through. He could see the wheels turning in their heads, the frantic calculations of men trapped by their own actions. Marcus knew that panic was the worst emotion to deal with in this situation. Panic made people unpredictable, rash. It turned mistakes into catastrophes. And right now, both officers were teetering on the edge, their fear bubbling up into something far more dangerous. Robertson, the stockier officer, stepped forward, his eyes wide with something between fear and rage. His voice came out tight, almost a growl. "What the hell are we supposed to do, Hanks? You heard the call. We've got a general in handcuffs. If he talks, if this gets out, we're screwed. They'll bury us." Hanks didn't respond immediately, his jaw clenched so tight that Marcus could see the muscles twitching beneath his skin. He was still gripping his weapon, as if it was the only thing grounding him in reality. For a brief moment, Marcus thought that maybe, just maybe, they would see reason. That they would take a step back, realize the severity of their actions, and end this nightmare before it spiraled further out of control. But the flicker of hope was short-lived. "Shut up," Hanks finally spat, his voice low and shaky. "Just shut the hell up, Robertson. I'm thinking." Thinking. Marcus knew what that meant. They weren't trying to figure out how to de-escalate this situation. They were trying to figure out how to cover it up. Marcus' heart pounded in his chest as the reality of the moment sank in. He was still pinned against his car, handcuffed, vulnerable. His rank, his status, none of it mattered. These men were scared, and scared men were capable of anything. The cold metal of the cuffs bit into Marcus' wrists, but the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the rising dread in his stomach. He had faced enemies on the battlefield, seen the horrors of war, but this felt different. This felt personal. The animosity, the racial bias, the fear of exposure, it all coalesced into something toxic and unpredictable. "Look," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm, "we can end this right now. No one has to know about this. Just take the cuffs off, and we walk away from this situation." Hank's eyes flickered to Marcus, but the fear in them had hardened into something colder. "You think that's going to work? You think we can just let you go and pretend none of this happened? You'll report us the second you get the chance." Marcus shook his head. "I'm not interested in ruining your careers. I just want to get home to my family. This is a misunderstanding, nothing more. Let's not turn it into something it doesn't have to be." But Robertson wasn't having it. His panic was quickly giving way to anger, and Marcus could see the shift in his body language, the way his shoulders squared up, the way his fists clenched and unclenched as if he was gearing up for a fight. "A misunderstanding," Robertson barked. "You think this is just a misunderstanding? You're sitting here in a stolen car, with fake ID, and now you're telling us you're a general. You expect us to believe that?" Marcus felt a surge of frustration rise within him. He had already shown them his military ID, yet they refused to acknowledge it. To them, he was still the enemy, an outsider, a threat. Nothing he said seemed to penetrate the thick wall of prejudice that surrounded their perception of him. "I've already shown you my ID," Marcus said, his voice growing sharper now. "You know who I am." The radio call confirmed it. "You're in over your heads, and the best thing you can do right now is admit your mistake and let me go." But Hanks wasn't listening anymore. His mind was already elsewhere, locked in a battle between self-preservation and the crushing fear of what came next. Marcus could see the fear turn into fire, a dangerous transformation that signaled there would be no reasoning with them now. Robertson moved closer, his face inches from Marcus. The smell of sweat and adrenaline clung to him, his breath hot and erratic. "You don't get it, do you?" he hissed. "It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what the radio said. You're just another guy who got too big for his boots, and now you're gonna pay for it." The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. In that moment, Marcus realized that this wasn't just about him. This was about something far bigger, far more insidious. This was about power. About two men who had been given authority, and who now, faced with their own mistakes, were doubling down on that power rather than admit they had made an error. It wasn't just about race, though that was undeniably part of it. It was about control, about maintaining their sense of superiority, their belief that they were untouchable, even when the truth stared them in the face. Marcus had seen this kind of behavior before, in soldiers who had lost sight of the mission, who had let their fear and desperation cloud their judgment. But here, on the streets of the city he had sworn to protect, it was different. These men weren't soldiers. They weren't following orders or protocols. They were acting on their basest instincts, and that made them infinitely more dangerous. Hanks finally moved, taking a step toward Marcus. His face was pale, his hands still trembling slightly. "We can't let him go," he muttered, more to himself than to Robertson. "If he talks, we're finished." Robertson nodded, his expression hardening. "We've already gone too far. There's no way out of this." Marcus' pulse quickened as he realized what they were saying. They weren't just talking about arresting him. They were talking about something much worse, something final. "Listen to yourselves," Marcus said, his voice rising. "You're making a mistake, and you know it. Don't compound it. You don't want this on your conscience. Think about your families, your careers. Don't throw it all away over a misunderstanding." But the more he spoke, the more determined they seemed. The fear had consumed them, morphed into a primal need to protect themselves at all costs. And Marcus knew, in that moment, that he was in real danger. Hank's hand moved toward his gun, and Marcus' heart skipped a beat. His military training kicked in, every muscle in his body tensing, ready to act if necessary. But he was still handcuffed, still at their mercy. Robertson was pacing now, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "What the hell are we supposed to do, Hanks? We can't just let him go. He's seen our faces. He knows who we are." Marcus' mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to diffuse the situation before it escalated into something irreversible. But there were no easy answers, no backup plan. He was alone in this, and the two men standing before him were on the verge of making a choice that could ruin all of their lives. And then, in the distance, Marcus heard something. Another siren, growing louder, drawing closer. Reinforcements. The cavalry had arrived. But as the siren drew nearer, Marcus realized that this could go one of two ways. Either the additional officers would de-escalate the situation, or it would push Hanks and Robertson further into their desperation. He prayed for the former, but he braced himself for the latter. A desperate gambit. The approaching sirens cut through the night air like a lifeline for Marcus, yet they were a double-edged sword. His pulse quickened as he recognized the possibility that these new officers could either be his salvation or his doom. The very sound that should have brought relief could instead escalate this already volatile situation. Hanks and Robertson, now visibly panicking, exchanged frantic glances as the wail of the approaching police car grew louder and its flashing lights became visible in the distance. For a brief moment, Marcus allowed himself to hope. Maybe these officers, when they arrived, would see the truth. Maybe they would recognize the mistake for what it was, undo these cuffs, and de-escalate this mess. But as he looked at the two men in front of him, their eyes wild with fear and uncertainty, he knew it wasn't that simple. Desperation had its grip on them now, and desperate men make dangerous decisions. Hank's face had gone pale, the beads of sweat now running down his temple as he struggled to maintain control of the situation. His hand hovered nervously near his holster, and Marcus could see the way his fingers twitched, as if itching to pull his weapon. Robertson, on the other hand, was pacing frantically, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He was muttering to himself, but his words were lost in the cacophony of his own spiraling thoughts. "Damn it, what do we do?" Robertson hissed, his voice shaking. "If they find him like this, we're done for. They'll ask questions. They'll figure it out." Hank shot a look at Marcus, his gaze cold and calculating. For a moment, Marcus saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or the remnants of a conscience that hadn't yet fully surrendered to fear. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, replaced by the hard, steely resolve of a man who had already made his decision. "We can't let them find him like this," Hanks muttered, almost to himself. "If the others show up and see what we've done, they'll start asking questions. They'll dig. And once they dig, it's over." Marcus knew that Hanks was right. The arrival of another patrol car, with its lights flashing and officers stepping out with fresh eyes, could easily unravel the fragile narrative these two men had constructed. But it could also push them into making a fatal mistake. Marcus had seen this type of fear before, when men on the battlefield realized they had cornered themselves, and the only option they saw was to lash out. The sound of the siren was closer now, only a few streets away. There was no time left. Hanks turned to Robertson, his voice tight with tension. "We've got to do something. If they see him in cuffs like this, they'll know something's off. We'll lose everything." Robertson stopped pacing, his face pale with dread. His mind was clearly racing, trying to find a way out of the mess they had created. And then something dark passed over his expression, an idea that was as reckless as it was dangerous. He glanced at Marcus, then back at Hanks. "We could say he resisted arrest," Robertson suggested, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "We could say he attacked us. We had no choice but to defend ourselves." Marcus' blood ran cold. The words were like a death sentence hanging in the air. It was the oldest and most sinister excuse, one that had been used far too many times to justify brutality against men who looked like him. The resisting arrest lie had been the end for too many black men before him, and he knew that once that story was told, the truth would be buried beneath a pile of fabricated reports and skewed testimonies. Hank's eyes flicked toward Marcus, sizing him up, considering the possibility. Marcus could feel the weight of their decision looming over him, the danger creeping closer with every second. He knew that if they went down this path, it could be the end of his career, his freedom, his life. "No," Marcus said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You're not going to do that." Robertson sneered, taking a step closer to Marcus. "Oh, really? And what's stopping us? We've already got you in cuffs. We say you attacked us. Who's going to believe you over two officers?" Marcus locked eyes with him, refusing to back down. "I'm a general in the United States Army. You think no one's going to notice if I suddenly disappear, or if some fabricated story pops up about me resisting arrest? My colleagues, my superiors, they will investigate, and when they do, your lies will unravel. You can't cover this up." The weight of Marcus' words seemed to sink in, if only for a moment. Hanks hesitated, doubt flickering in his eyes. He knew that Marcus was right. A man of his rank and stature didn't just vanish without questions being asked, without a serious investigation. But fear still had its claws in him, and it was clear that Hanks was still trying to weigh the risks. The sirens were right around the corner now, the flashing lights reflecting off the nearby buildings. Time was running out. "You don't want to do this," Marcus continued, his voice calm but commanding. "You don't want to make this worse than it already is. You made a mistake. Own it. Take off these cuffs, and let's end this before it spirals even further." For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the approaching patrol car. Marcus could see the internal struggle in Hank's eyes. He was teetering on the edge, one wrong move away from making a choice that would ruin not just Marcus' life, but his own. But Robertson wasn't swayed. His fear had turned into something else now, something darker, more dangerous. His gaze was hard, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not going to jail over this," Robertson spat, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "We've come too far." And then, in an instant, everything happened at once. The second patrol car pulled up, its tires screeching to a halt on the street behind them. The flashing lights illuminated the scene, casting long shadows across the pavement. Two new officers stepped out of the car, their faces masked by the bright headlights. For a split second, the street was bathed in silence, the tension crackling in the air like a live wire. Hanks froze, his hand still hovering near his gun, his eyes darting between Marcus and the approaching officers. Robertson, meanwhile, seemed ready to snap, his entire body coiled with panic and desperation. Marcus knew this was the moment. It was a delicate balance. One wrong word, one wrong move, and the situation would tip into chaos. "Evening, officers," Hanks called out, his voice strained but trying to sound casual. "Just a routine stop here." The two new officers exchanged glances, clearly suspicious of what they were seeing. One of them, a tall, lean man with a calm but sharp expression, nodded slowly and began walking toward them. His partner, a shorter, stockier woman, hung back, her hand resting on her radio, ready for any escalation. "Everything all right here?" the tall officer asked, his tone neutral but pointed. His eyes flicked between Marcus, still handcuffed against the car, and Hanks, who was doing his best to appear in control. Hanks hesitated, his mind clearly racing to come up with a plausible explanation. But before he could speak, Robertson jumped in. "Yeah, everything's under control," Robertson said quickly, his voice a little too loud, a little too eager. "Just a routine traffic stop. The suspect here was driving erratically, and, well, he resisted when we tried to detain him." The tall officer's brow furrowed as he glanced at Marcus, taking in the scene. "Resisted, huh?" His voice was skeptical. "What kind of resistance are we talking about?" Marcus could feel the tension between Hanks and Robertson like a physical force. They were cornered, trapped by their own lies, and now they were scrambling to cover their tracks. But Marcus wasn't about to let them bury him with false accusations. "That's not what happened," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "These officers pulled me over without cause, handcuffed me, and refused to check my identification, despite the fact that I am General Marcus Reynolds of the U.S. Army. They know who I am, and they've been trying to cover their mistake ever since." The tall officer's eyes widened slightly at the mention of Marcus' rank. He glanced at his partner, who was now paying much closer attention. "General," the officer repeated, his tone sharp with new awareness. "Is that true?" Marcus nodded. "Check my ID. It's in the glove compartment, along with my military documents. Everything you need is right there." The officer's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He turned back to Hanks, his eyes narrowing. "Is this true?" Hanks swallowed hard, his face pale. He was out of options, and he knew it. He hesitated for a moment, as if still considering whether to double down on the lie or come clean. But the weight of the situation had finally caught up to him. With a heavy sigh, Hanks nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's true." For a moment, The world seemed to stand still. Truth unraveled in the dark. The silence that followed Hank's admission felt like the world had momentarily stopped spinning. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, a steady drumbeat of tension that reverberated in the cool night air. His muscles ached from being restrained for so long, his wrists raw from the tight metal cuffs. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that Hanks had finally, begrudgingly, admitted the truth. But Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The two newly arrived officers exchanged looks, their expressions shifting from professional detachment to something far more cautious and concerned. The taller officer, who had been doing most of the talking, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in the full scope of the situation. He wasn't just seeing a routine traffic stop gone wrong. He was seeing two officers caught in a web of their own lies, trying desperately to untangle themselves before the consequences crashed down on them. Robertson, however, wasn't ready to give in. His face twisted into a mask of stubborn defiance, and Marcus could see the rage simmering just beneath the surface. This man had gone too far in his mind to back down now. For Robertson, admitting the truth wasn't just an admission of guilt, it was the destruction of everything he had clung to, the authority he wielded, the power he thought he possessed. To admit he was wrong was to admit that the world didn't work the way he wanted it to, and that was something he couldn't accept. "Wait a minute," Robertson barked, stepping toward the new officers. His voice was loud, a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "This guy's lying. He's trying to trick you. He pulled that general crap out of nowhere. We saw him driving erratically, and when we pulled him over, he got aggressive. You've got to believe us." Marcus watched as Robertson's eyes darted between the new officers, his panic evident in every movement. He was grasping at straws, clinging to the last shreds of a narrative that was unraveling with each passing second. But the desperation in his voice was undeniable, and even the newly arrived officers could see it. The shorter officer, a woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority, stepped forward now. Her gaze flicked from Robertson to Marcus, then back again. "Driving erratically?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "What exactly does that mean? And why is he still in cuffs if all he did was resist a routine traffic stop?" Robertson hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. But there were none. The truth was out there, hanging between them, and no amount of shouting or deflection could pull it back. Hanks, still standing frozen by Marcus' car, finally seemed to deflate. His shoulders slumped, and the rigidness of his posture gave way to exhaustion. The adrenaline that had fueled his panic was draining away, leaving behind only the crushing weight of his mistakes. He looked at the tall officer, his eyes hollow and tired. "It's not like that," Hank said quietly, his voice hoarse. We thought he was someone else. We didn't know. And then things just got out of control." The taller officer, who had been watching Hanks with a critical eye, nodded slowly, though his expression remained unreadable. He was processing everything, weighing the truth against the lies, trying to make sense of the chaos that had unfolded on this quiet street. Marcus felt a flicker of vindication, but it was buried beneath layers of exhaustion and frustration. Yes, Hanks had admitted his fault, but the damage had already been done. He had been handcuffed, humiliated, treated like a criminal for no other reason than the fact that two officers saw him as a threat. Not because of anything he had done, but because of who he was. And more importantly, what he looked like. The taller officer walked over to Marcus, his movements careful, measured. He reached into Marcus' car and retrieved the documents from the glove compartment. As he flipped through the paperwork, his eyes scanning Marcus' military ID, his expression shifted. There was no mistaking the authenticity of the documents. Marcus was exactly who he said he was. A general in the United States Army. A man who had dedicated his life to service, to protecting the very country that had allowed this injustice to occur. The officer looked up, his face tight with a mixture of regret and professionalism. "General Reynolds," he said softly, I'm going to have these cuffs removed immediately. I'm sorry for what you've been through." He signaled to the shorter officer, who quickly moved to Marcus' side, pulling out the key for the handcuffs. As the cold metal finally clicked open and fell away from his wrists, Marcus felt an overwhelming wave of relief wash over him, though it was tempered by the lingering anger and disbelief. Marcus flexed his hands, the feeling of freedom bittersweet, as he rubbed his sore wrists. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but low, his eyes focused on the ground in front of him. The moment of justice, small as it was, didn't erase the deeper pain that had been inflicted tonight. The officers had shown him what many others like him already knew, that rank, achievements, and service meant little in the face of prejudice. The shorter officer took a step back, clearly uncomfortable with the weight of what had happened. "General, if you'd like to press charges, we can start the process right now," she offered, her voice tentative. Marcus looked up, his gaze flickering between the two new officers, and then back to Hanks and Robertson. Robertson was still seething, his fists clenched at his sides, but Hanks had dropped his head, his expression one of defeat. The anger that had surged within Marcus earlier was now tempered by something more profound: weariness. He had seen this kind of fear and hatred before, in other forms, on other battlegrounds. This one, though, had cut deeper than most. He could press charges. He could take this further, drag Hanks and Robertson through a legal process that would likely cost them their jobs, their reputations, and maybe even their freedom. And perhaps part of him wanted that, to see them held accountable for what they had done. But there was another part of him that understood the futility of it all. He knew that punishing these two officers wouldn't change the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. It wouldn't stop the next black man from being profiled, humiliated, or worse. Marcus sighed, feeling the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice measured. "But right now, I just want to go home." The tall officer nodded, his expression respectful. "We'll give you an escort, General. Make sure you get home safely." As the officers moved to clear the scene, Marcus watched Hanks and Robertson, both of them standing off to the side, their faces a mix of fear and shame. For Hanks, there was a quiet remorse in his eyes, as if he had realized too late the gravity of his actions. Robertson, however, still radiated defiance. Marcus could see that he hadn't learned anything from this encounter. He was too consumed by his own fear and prejudice to reflect on the damage he had caused. As Marcus got back into his car, the adrenaline from the night's events slowly began to wear off, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the feel of it grounding him in the reality of what had happened. The escort vehicle pulled in front of him, its lights flashing in a much calmer rhythm now, a signal of safe passage. But for Marcus, the road ahead still felt uncertain. The truth had been unraveled, but it was a truth that spoke to something much larger than this one night. It was a truth about the country he had sworn to defend, a country that still struggled to see him, and others like him, for who they truly were. As he followed the police car out of the city, the streets now eerily quiet, Marcus couldn't help but wonder how many more times this story would be repeated, how many more lives would be shaken, shattered, or lost before the system finally changed. He had survived tonight's encounter, but he knew that others might not be so lucky. And so, as the city lights began to fade in his rearview mirror, Marcus Reynolds, General in the United States Army, drove home, not as a man triumphant, but as a man who had seen the cracks in the very foundation he had spent his life defending. A man who, despite all his power and rank, had been reminded that some battles weren't fought on foreign soil, but right here at home. A reckoning at dawn. The soft glow of dawn began to break across the horizon as Marcus pulled into his driveway. The familiar outline of his home, normally a place of warmth and refuge, felt distant now, as if the events of the night had erected an invisible barrier between him and the life he had worked so hard to build. His body was exhausted, his mind heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. The echo of the sirens, the biting cold of the handcuffs, and the voices of those officers clung to him, refusing to dissipate into the morning air. His fingers still rested on the steering wheel, gripping it with the intensity of someone trying to regain control, not just of the vehicle but of his life. The rhythmic hum of the engine was the only sound that broke the silence, and even that seemed distant, muffled by the fog of disbelief still swirling in his mind. His hands, now free from the cuffs but still sore from the tight grip they had held on him, flexed involuntarily as he tried to shake the lingering feeling of restraint. The front porch light flickered on, and through the window, Marcus saw his wife, Diane, standing at the door. She had been waiting for him, worry etched into her face. It was a face that had seen him through deployments, crises, and long stretches of silence when the horrors of war followed him home. But tonight, he wasn't returning from a battlefield across the world. This battle had unfolded just miles from their home, in a place where he should have been safe. Taking a deep breath, Marcus shut off the engine and opened the door. The cool morning air hit him, sharp and fresh, but it did little to clear his mind. As he stepped out of the car, he felt the weight of the night's events hang on him like a shroud. Diane stepped down from the porch, her eyes wide with concern as she hurried to him. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice thick with worry. "What happened?" He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. How could he explain it? How could he describe the humiliation, the fear, the anger that had boiled inside him as he was treated like a common criminal? A man who had given everything for his country, reduced to nothing more than a threat because of the color of his skin. Diane's hand found his arm, her touch gentle but grounding, pulling him back from the swirl of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "Let's go inside," she said softly, leading him toward the house. "You can tell me when you're ready." Inside, the house was quiet. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway was the only sound as they moved into the living room. The early morning light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Marcus sank into his favorite armchair, the one he had dreamed of returning to all night. But now, sitting there, it offered no comfort. His body felt heavy, weighed down by the invisible scars of the night. Diane sat across from him, her eyes searching his face. She knew him better than anyone, knew when he was holding something back, knew when the burden was too much to bear alone. She waited patiently, giving him the space he needed to find the words. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice low and gravelly. It was the police. Diane's eyes flickered with confusion. "The police? What do you mean?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together as if he was still trying to hold himself together. "They pulled me over, said I was driving erratically." His voice was bitter, the words sharp as they left his mouth. "Didn't matter that I told them who I was. They didn't care. They saw a black man in a nice car, and that was enough." Diane's face tightened, her hands curling into fists on her lap. "Marcus, are you serious? They knew you were a general." Marcus nodded, his jaw clenched. "Eventually, after they handcuffed me, after they shoved me against my own car like I was a criminal. They didn't believe me, didn't care about my ID, my rank, my service. None of it mattered." Diane's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and horror. She had heard stories like this before, of course. Everyone had. Stories of black men being stopped, harassed, brutalized by police. But this was Marcus, her husband, a decorated general, a man who had spent decades fighting for his country, leading soldiers, making life and death decisions. And still, even with all that, he hadn't been spared. "They cuffed you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They did more than that," Marcus muttered, rubbing his wrists as if trying to erase the memory of the cold metal cutting into his skin. "They tried to cover it up, lied to the officers who came later, said I resisted arrest. Tried to make it sound like I was the problem." Diane's anger was palpable now, her body trembling with a mixture of rage and helplessness. She stood up, pacing the floor as if trying to burn off the fury building inside her. How could they do this? How could they treat you like this? Because to them, I'm just another black man, Marcus said, his voice hard. Doesn't matter what I've done, what I've achieved. To them, my skin is a threat. My car is a crime. They didn't see a general. They didn't see a man who has dedicated his life to service. They saw what they wanted to see, a target. Diane stopped pacing, turning to look at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. We have to do something, Marcus. You can't just let them get away with this. Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. What am I supposed to do? Press charges? Sure, I could. But will that change anything? Will it stop the next man from going through what I just went through? It's a system, Diane. It's not just about those two officers. It's about the entire system that lets this happen, that allows men like them to operate with impunity. Diane walked over to him, kneeling by his side, her hand resting on his knee. You've fought battles before. You've stood up for what's right your whole life. This is another battle, Marcus. Maybe it won't change everything. But if you don't stand up now, then what? Marcus looked down at her, his heart aching. She was right. He had fought battles his whole life, not just on the battlefield, but in boardrooms, in backrooms, in the very halls of power where decisions about people's lives were made. He had fought for equality, for justice, for a system that lived up to the ideals it preached. But this was personal. This wasn't just a battle for the future. This was a reckoning with his own sense of self, his own place in the world he had fought to defend. I know, he said quietly, but I'm tired, Diane. I'm so damn tired. She nodded, her eyes softening with understanding. I know you are, but you're not alone in this. You've never been alone. Marcus swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling into him. She was right. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was what gave him the strength to keep fighting. The clock in the hallway chimed softly, marking the passage of time. Outside, the first birds of the morning began to sing, their calls clear and bright against the stillness of the dawn. The world was waking up, oblivious to the battles that had been fought in the dark, the truths that had been uncovered, the lives that had been shaken. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weariness settle deep into his bones. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, something more powerful, a sense of resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been treated as less than, who had been judged not by their character but by the color of their skin. He was fighting for his family, for his children, for the future he wanted them to inherit. Slowly, he stood up, his body heavy but his mind clear. You're right, he said, his voice steady. This is a battle I can't walk away from. Diane smiled softly, standing up beside him. We'll fight it together. Marcus nodded, the first light of dawn filtering through the window, and casting a soft glow on his face. He didn't know what the future held, or how long this battle would last, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't done yet. And this fight, like all the others before it, was one worth fighting.